Long before the arrival of European ships on the horizon, the vast continent of Australia was already alive with stories. Its lands, rivers, and coasts had borne witness to more than 60,000 years of human history, untold, intricate, and deeply intertwined with the natural world. The Aboriginal peoples, custodians of this ancient land, had developed languages, traditions, and knowledge systems as old as the sandstone cliffs and as enduring as the red earth itself. Chapter 1. The First Dawn. In the east, where the sun rose over the ranges and bathed the forests in golden light, the Nganwo people prepared for another day. Stories of the Dreamtime, the sacred narrative of creation, passed from elders to children, guiding not only morality but the practical knowledge of survival. The rivers and hills were alive with songlines, ancient pathways across the land, connecting sacred sites, waterholes, and hunting grounds. Each songline was a story, a memory, a law of the land. To walk the land without knowing its stories was unthinkable. To misstep could be dangerous, not only physically, but spiritually. Thousands of miles away, along the vast western deserts, other groups moved with equal precision. The Martu people knew where each seasonal bush fruit would ripen, where water could be found even in the heart of the desert, and which stories would protect them from the unseen spirits lurking in the red sands at night. These were not merely legends, they were survival manuals encoded in narrative. Chapter 2. Sea Voyagers and Ancient Paths. Long before the European navigators, there were whispers of visitors from across the seas. Some scholars suggest that Indonesian trepangers, the moccasins, had been sailing to northern Australia for centuries before 1700, harvesting trepang along Arnhem Land's coast. But the untold history goes deeper. These interactions were not just trade, they were cultural exchanges. Languages were shared, ceremonies observed, and knowledge of the tides, stars, and seasons passed between peoples. Yet most of this history remains largely absent from mainstream accounts. Meanwhile, the interior of the continent retained its own secrets. Rock art, etched in ochre and charcoal, depicted beings both human and spiritual. These carvings, some tens of thousands of years old, told stories of flood, fire, and migration. They were records of memory in a land where written text did not exist, where survival and storytelling were inseparable. Chapter 3. The Southern Shores. The southern coastlines, dotted with rocky inlets and dense forests, remained a mystery to the outside world. Yet for the peoples of these lands, every bay, reef, and dune was alive with meaning. Seasonal migrations were timed with the movement of fish and birds, while stories of ancestral spirits dictated which areas could be accessed at certain times. The laws of the land were not written on paper, but sung in songlines, remembered in dance, and acted in ceremonies. As the centuries passed, these societies adapted to climate changes, droughts, and shifting ecological patterns. Oral histories chronicled these changes, how rivers dried, how forests burned, how new species arrived and old ones vanished. These were chronicles of a land alive and in motion, yet they were largely invisible to the outside world, untold yet persistent. Chapter 4. European Horizons. In 1606, Dutch navigator William Janssen made one of the earliest recorded European landfalls on the Cape York Peninsula. His arrival marked the beginning of centuries of partial understanding, misinterpretation, and eventual colonization. But long before formal claims and maps, the land had a story of its own. Janssen's maps were crude, his journals limited. The Aboriginal custodians, with millennia of deep connection to the land, remained largely unrecorded in these accounts. Throughout the 17th century, other Dutch and later British navigators charted coasts and rivers, leaving fragmented records. Ship logs spoke of unknown peoples, dense forests, and mysterious sounds. What they failed to record, intentionally or not, was the depth of culture, spirituality, and governance present across the continent. These stories remained untold, only passed through oral history. Chapter 5. Hidden Conflicts. With the arrival of settlers in the late 18th century, untold histories turned tragic. The first fleet arrived at Port Jackson in 1788, and with it came disease, displacement, and conflict. Aboriginal communities, who had thrived for tens of thousands of years, faced unprecedented disruption. Smallpox and influenza decimated populations. Sacred lands were seized, hunting grounds restricted, and entire cultures forced into hiding. Yet in this darkness, stories of resistance persisted. Small hidden skirmishes, acts of defiance, and secret meetings went unrecorded in official histories. Families carried forward these memories, teaching the next generation through cautionary tales and secret ceremonies. These were histories that colonial records would never acknowledge, histories that remained alive in song. Coast had begun to expand into the hinterlands. Settlers, driven by the promise of land, wealth, and opportunity, often encountered indigenous groups whose histories and connections to the land stretched back tens of thousands of years. For Aboriginal people, these were not simply strangers, they were invaders, disrupting sacred lands, disrupting food sources, and threatening cultural survival. The clashes that followed were often understated in official colonial records. Skirmishes in the bush, retaliatory attacks, and covert resistance campaigns left traces only in oral history. Families whispered tales of ancestors who hid in the forests, who led groups away from settler encroachment, and who preserved their culture under the constant threat of violence. Chapter 7. Convicts and New Lives. The first fleet's arrival in 1788 brought convicts from Britain to establish penal colonies. By the early 19th century, the convicts' presence had transformed parts of the coast. Many convicts, while serving their sentences, documented glimpses of the land and the people they encountered. Their letters, diaries, and sketches provide an incomplete but invaluable record of early colonial life. Convicts were not just laborers, they were chroniclers, observers, and sometimes accidental historians. Through their eyes, one glimpses the tension between the settlers' ambitions and the resistance of the land's original custodians. Stories of convicts who escaped into the bush and lived alongside Aboriginal groups, adopting local practices, persisted in underground networks of oral tradition. Chapter 8. Gold Rush and Cultural Collision. The mid-19th century gold rushes transformed Australia's social and economic landscape. Tens of thousands of immigrants from Britain, Europe, and China flocked to Victoria, New South Wales, and Tasmania. Towns sprung up overnight, and with them new forms of law, commerce, and conflict. Aboriginal communities, already pushed to the margins, faced further displacement. Sacred sites were dug up, rivers polluted, and cultural practices disrupted. Yet amidst this turmoil, untold stories of cooperation, cultural exchange, and adaptation endured. Some Aboriginal guides helped miners locate water and resources, preserving centuries-old environmental knowledge that the newcomers could not replicate. These contributions were rarely acknowledged in official records, yet they shaped the success and survival of many early settlements. Chapter 9. Silent Resistance. Throughout the 19th century, Aboriginal resistance continued quietly. Guerrilla tactics, avoidance strategies, and secret networks allowed communities to survive. Entire clans would relocate to avoid colonial patrols, preserving both lives and cultural practices. Elders ensured that songs, ceremonies, and knowledge of sacred sites were passed on, often in coded forms that outsiders could not decipher. These untold acts of defiance were critical to the survival of indigenous cultures. Many Australians today remain unaware of the complexity and sophistication of these strategies. The colonial narrative, focused on conquest and settlement, largely ignored the resilience, leadership, and wisdom of the Aboriginal peoples. Chapter 10: The Frontier of Knowledge. Beyond conflict, the 19th century was also a period of scientific curiosity. Naturalists, anthropologists, and explorers documented flora, fauna, and indigenous practices. However, their records were often incomplete or biased, colored by Eurocentric interpretations. Some stories of indigenous innovation, such as sophisticated water management systems, fire stick farming, and ecological knowledge, were dismissed or forgotten. These represent a vast, untold legacy that modern Australians are only beginning to rediscover and appreciate. Meanwhile, the continent's vast interior, once thought inhospitable, began to reveal its secrets. Archaeological discoveries, such as ancient rock shelters, cave paintings, and tools, highlighted the depth of human occupation long before European arrival. Every artifact, every site, told a story that had survived countless generations. Chapter 11: Cities, Railways, and the Growing Nation. By the late 1800s, Australia's colonies were becoming more urbanized. Sydney and Melbourne emerged as major cities, connected by newly laid railways. The expansion of infrastructure brought settlers into closer contact with both the land and the remaining indigenous communities. Stories of early city life, markets, schools, hospitals, and theaters showed a society rapidly modernizing, often at the expense of traditional ways. Yet hidden histories lingered. Hidden communities of Aboriginal people continued to live in the outskirts of cities, preserving their traditions while navigating the pressures of colonial laws and policies. These stories were rarely documented, but were critical to understanding the social fabric of the young nation. Chapter 12: Seeds of Federation. As the 19th century drew to a close, Australia's colonies began discussions of federation. Political debates, economic planning, and cultural ambitions shaped a new national identity. Aboriginal voices were mostly excluded from these discussions, yet their presence, history, and knowledge remained embedded in the land and the cultural memory of the nation. Chapter 13: Gallipoli and the Great War. The dawn of the 20th century brought global conflict to Australia's shores in ways that few could have imagined. In 1914, when the First World War erupted, Australians answered the call of the British Empire, sending tens of thousands of men to foreign battlefields. The landing at Gallipoli in 1915 became a defining moment in the nation's psyche, though much of what occurred there remained untold for decades. Among the soldiers were men of diverse backgrounds, including Indigenous Australians, whose service went largely unrecognized. They fought bravely, often without the rights of citizenship, and their stories were omitted from official military records. Letters home, sketches, and diaries offer glimpses into their courage, resilience, and the unique perspective of men who carried both pride and the weight of unacknowledged inequality. Chapter 14: Between the Wars. After the war, Australia faced social and economic upheaval. Cities grew, industries expanded, and women who had taken on new roles during the war began to claim their place in society. Yet beneath the surface, Indigenous communities continued to experience marginalization. The 1920s and 1930s saw policies aimed at assimilation, the removal of children from families, and a systematic erasure of cultural practices. These untold stories of loss and resilience persisted quietly within communities, passed down through oral traditions. Chapter 15: World War II and Homefront Struggles. World War II brought new challenges. Australian troops fought across the Pacific, North Africa, and Europe, while civilians faced rationing, air raid drills, and anxiety about invasion. Northern Australia, particularly Darwin, endured Japanese bombing raids, a chapter less remembered in popular history. Indigenous Australians contributed to the war effort both as soldiers and as laborers, often without recognition. Amid these conflicts, untold narratives of courage emerged on the home front. Families maintained farms and businesses, communities organized volunteer defense groups, and knowledge of survival, rooted in indigenous practices, helped sustain food security and resilience during wartime shortages. Chapter 16: Post-War Reconstruction. After 1945, Australia entered a period of reconstruction and growth. Immigration from Europe reshaped cities, industries expanded, and modern infrastructure began to define urban life. Yet the stories of Aboriginal resilience during this period, navigating government policies, urban relocation, and cultural preservation, remained largely untold. Communities maintained traditions through secret ceremonies and storytelling, quietly resisting cultural erasure. Chapter 17: The Fight for Rights. The mid-20th century saw a slow but pivotal shift. Aboriginal activism grew, leading to significant milestones. The 1967 referendum that recognized Indigenous Australians in the census, and campaigns for land rights across the country. These stories, long ignored in mainstream histories, highlight the tireless efforts of men and women who fought for recognition, justice, and cultural survival. Untold histories of grassroots movements, secret councils, and community-led initiatives shaped the modern nation. Elders shared knowledge discreetly, ensuring that younger generations understood their heritage, even as official records often omitted them. Chapter 18: Rediscovering Lost Narratives. In recent decades, historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists began uncovering forgotten chapters of Australian history. Ancient sites were protected, rock art documented, and oral histories recorded for future generations. Stories of indigenous innovations, early explorers' untold interactions, and forgotten settlements began resurfacing. Documentaries, books, and educational programs increasingly highlighted these narratives, yet many stories remain only partially known. The land itself, its sacred sites, rivers, deserts, and coasts retains echoes of histories that cannot be fully captured in records, yet persist in memory and tradition. Chapter 19: Modern Connections. Today, Australia is a vibrant, multicultural nation. Its modern cities and rural landscapes exist alongside some of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Understanding Australia requires more than textbooks. It demands listening to untold stories, the struggles and resilience of Aboriginal peoples, the forgotten convicts and pioneers, and the silent witnesses of its lands and waters. Terra Australis Untold aims to bring forward these narratives, not to rewrite history,